where did your ball go, where did it land. There's even a picture on the screen that shows you where your ball lands. So that's going to be fun, and yes, there will be prizes. So if you haven't tried out the TrackMan, this is a great opportunity to get some exposure to it. So that's next Saturday. And as you can see, if you came through certain parts of the clubhouse, we are replacing some of the carpeting in the clubhouse. Little overdue, but we're going to get that done. The Fowler room and the stairways in the clubhouse will be completed by the end of this coming week. So when you come back next weekend, you'll see that all done. And the offices, the administrative offices, will be done the week of the 16th. So by the time the end of that week rolls around, we'll be pretty much back up to snuff there. I'm very, very happy to make a special announcement tonight, and I'm talking really happy, that we have a very special guest with us here this evening, aside from Mr. Wilding. Tonight is the first night, as a matter of fact, I think it might be the first several hours of our new clubhouse manager, Gita Gemery. Gita, would you please stand up and wave to everybody so they know how to do it? So I think most of you probably read my note that I sent out recently about Gita. She is very much looking forward to meeting all of you. I didn't want to put her on the spot too much tonight and bring her up to the microphone, but I hope you'll take a chance to introduce yourself afterwards. Gita will be here for the winter warmers throughout the winter and looks forward to meeting all of you. So thank you, Gita. Sorry to put you on the spot. After tonight's presentation, Mr. Wilding will be available to sign copies of his book. He actually has a few copies of his book that he's going to be talking about this evening. We'll be set up right back here if you want to get a signed copy. You're just going to let us know, Chloe, or maybe we'll have a sign-up sheet there. Just write your name and member number down, and we'll take care of that on your club account. Each book is only $1,000. So let's see. Finally, when Don's presentation concludes, there'll be an opportunity for Q&A. We would ask respectfully that if you folks don't mind, please reserve your questions until after the speech or after the presentation. And when Don is done, we have a microphone set up in the back there, so if you are going to ask something, please use the microphone so that others can hear you and Don can hear you as well. Since the start of the millennium, Don Wilding has been telling stories of Cape Cod's Outer Beach history through lectures, video, and the written word. An award-winning writer and editor for Massachusetts newspapers for 35 years, Don pens the popular Shore Lore history column for the Cape Codder newspaper in Orleans. And he is the author of the book Henry Beston's Cape Cod, How the Outermost House Inspired a National Seashore, also A Brief History of Eastham on the Outer Beach of Cape Cod, and the upcoming Cape Cod Shipwrecks, Stories of Triumph and Tragedy. From the history, published by the History Press, my apologies. Don is also a tour guide and has taught Cape Cod history classes for NASA Community Education and the Open University in Wellfleet. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Don Wilding.
Thank you, John. I'm going to hold this. It's probably a little easier for me. First of all, let me ask, how many of you have read the book, The Outermost House? Okay. This is must-read stuff for Cape Cod. I got to tell you right now. It's the best book I've ever read, by far. Not that one, Beston's book. That one's pretty good, too. I'll tell you more about that later. What you see here is actually a picture of Beston at his outermost house. The house was located at what is now Coast Guard Beach. On the beach there. Many years ago, there was a lot more to that beach than there is now. Now it's a very flat sand spit. Back in those days, that barrier beach actually covered an area of extended almost 4 miles to the south. It was much wider. It was about a 1/4 mile wide, and there were towering dunes. Erosion took care of that, especially the blizzard of '78, which I'll tell you more about later. Okay, that's not good.
Thank you.
I hate when that happens. There we go. There we go. Yeah, right. So The Outermost House was referred to by the New York Times as a passionate book about winds, tides, seabirds, and stars, and what it's like to fall in love with the beach. His lovely beach is lovely still. On most foggy afternoons, the beach has not a soul but Henry Beston's on it. And that's pretty accurate to describe the atmosphere and the surroundings of what Beston was going through out there. This is the outermost house, what it looked like when it first came out, October 5th, 1928. It's never been out of print since. It's been through dozens of printings and editions. Perhaps maybe you have one of these earlier editions on your bookshelves at home. A lot of people get copies of the book, they lend it to a friend and they never get it back, and they buy it again, and then they repeat the thing and repeat the course, and it ends up being, they go through several copies of it. But it's a favorite of a lot of Cape Codders. Look, this is what the most recent edition of the outermost house looks like. This is the cover photo of it for the last 30 years or so. This photograph was taken by a woman named Nan Turner Waldron, who wrote a book called Journey to Outermost House. She actually had an opportunity to stay in Beston's house for a period of a couple of weeks every year between 1961 and 1977. So she knew firsthand what was going on. And I had the opportunity to meet Nan before she passed away in 2000, and she gave a lot of her research and photographs to me. So I've been using them in my presentation. She did talks like this also for many, many years. But getting to Henry Beston, Henry Beston is that little tyke sitting right there. He was born in 1888 in Quincy, right south of Boston. He was the son of a doctor, Dr. Joseph Sheehan. Dr. Joseph Sheehan was one of the founders of Quincy Hospital. Beston's mother, Marie, was from France originally, so she spoke French thoroughly. Henry and his brother, George, they both became bilingual. They were able to both speak English and French equally well. Henry really identified with his French side, and particularly with his mother. So he grew up in Quincy. He eventually went to Harvard, and I can show you right here, that's Henry right there. Henry Sheehan was his given name. He ended up changing it to Beston. That was a family name on his mother's side. As to why he did, nobody really knows for sure. But Sheehan, being an Irish name in Boston, early part of the 20th century, that might not have been in his favor. That's one theory that people have had. So graduating from Harvard, around 1911 with a master's, a few years later, war breaks out in Europe. And he, again, identifying with his French side, he answers the call to help out his mother's homeland. And he actually attempted to enlist with either the American or the French forces. They wouldn't take him because his vision was so bad because of, he had all kinds of different problems with his vision, but they thought it was okay for him to be part of the American Field Service and drive an ambulance, which could be a little problematic. So that's who he signed up with. And he leaves to go to France, and the understanding was he was not going to really be in the heart of battle. He was going to just be on the fringes, closer to Paris. And a lot of other writers also had signed up for ambulance driving duty in Europe. Ernest Hemingway was one. John Dos Passos, E.E. Cummings. These are some of the other names that served as ambulance drivers. Beston signed up to be an ambulance driver and thought he was going to be close to Paris. Well, the fighting got so bad, he ended up being in the middle of these conflicts. Battles like the Battle of Verdun, which was one of the bloodiest battles of World War I. And he was part of that, and it got to be really bad, and he just saw some of the most horrific things that anyone could imagine. his hometown newspaper, the Patriot Ledger, described that his service in the ambulance section took him right into the heat of the battle, where the trenches were strewn with dead and dying, and where huge shells from German cannons made life continually one of the greatest hazard. And this was an absolute horror show watching this. He saw things that nobody should ever witness. He told one story of how he saw a grenade going off in a soldier's hand. Another time he talked about how he was talking to a French soldier and all of a sudden a shell came in and exploded near them, and he dove for cover, and when he got up he turned around and there was the guy he was talking to, dead on the ground, his chest ripped open. He said he found a human heart, you know, wedged in a tree. I mean, these are the kind of things he saw. So he was really shaken by it, but it didn't really start to hit him because he had a job to do until he got home. And that's when it started to set in. And it led him to come to the reasoning that the war of today is a business. The people are the stockholders, and the object of the organization is the wisest application of violence to the enemy. So this is how he had come back, shaken by the war, and he was starting to deal with, you know, post-traumatic syndrome coming back from this. And he also served as a correspondent for the U.S. Navy. Being a writer, he was able to
Here, madam, would you like a drink?
serve writing reports for Stars and Stripes and things like that. And he saw things at sea too, you know, being aboard submarines, being aboard battleships, more death and destruction. So when he finally got home, it just all was really unsettling to him, and it took him a long time to really even to start to come to grips with it. And one of the things that later helped him come to grips with it was coming out here, and I'll get to that in a little bit. A friend of his, a guy named George Rogner, who I got to know briefly until he passed away. Actually, George and I were pen pals for about 10 years. And George would tell all these stories, and he said that Henry hated war with a vengeance and the political world that caused such conflicts. Brutal, destructive, innocent women and children being killed. He frowned severely as he uttered such descriptions. So he comes home from the war, settles in Boston, starts working for a publication that the Atlantic Monthly had bought, evaluating and propaganda that was coming out of Europe. And since he could speak French, he was a natural for the job. Well, after about a year of this, he discovered he hated the job. It was called The Living Age magazine. And he quit this very quickly. And he started writing books of fairy tales, you know, to get himself away from the war. He wrote a couple of books, one called The Starlight Wonder Book, and another one that was called The Firelight Fairy Book. And these two books were, you know, it was kind of therapeutic for him, and they were really charming fairy tales. But it really wasn't where he wanted to go. And right around this time, he started getting a lot of magazine assignments, and one of them was for the World's Work magazine. And he was sent out here to Cape Cod to write an article about the men from the Coast Guard stations along the outer beach who were walking and patrolling the beach in all kinds of horrible weather for shipwrecks. And they would also have to go out and rescue people who were shipwrecked. And he found this story fascinating. He was really heartened by the work these men were doing, putting their lives on the line, and they weren't really so much, they weren't taking lives like they were in the war, they were actually saving lives. And this really, he found this very heartening. And so he writes this magazine article, The Wardens of Cape Cod, and it was about 9 or 10 pages long. It was pretty lengthy, very descriptive. And if you read that, and then if you've ever read The Outermost House, you'll see some of the same stories in it. This was the beginning of The Outermost House. He wouldn't write that book for another 5 years. But this is where it all started, and he visited almost every one of the stations along here. He went out to Monomoy out there, which he referred to as a House of Usher country. And he visited the Cahoon Hollow Station in Wellfleet, which is now the Beachcomber. He was up at the stations in Provincetown, and Nauset. He was at all of them. And he seemed particularly endeared to the Nauset Station and beach there, the Barrier Beach. And this is where he eventually decided, I want to hang out here for a while. I like it here. And he starts coming to the beach. And in that magazine article, he writes, there are two Cape Cods in the world, one of the picturesque and familiar land of toy windmills, picnickers, and motorists. The other, the Cape which the sailors see, the Cape of the wild, houseless, outer shore, the countless tragic wrecks, the sandbars, and the shoals. So that was, how he looked at the Cape. And he was fascinated by what was going on the outer beach, not just with the Coast Guard, but with the natural world. He took a real liking to the natural world. And so while he was staying out here, he would stay just about anywhere. But as one woman told me up in Eastham, who has since passed, she always said, she was a historian, Marilyn Schofield. She said, Henry always knew where his next meal was coming from. So he was staying with a variety of different people. And one place that he rented out was this little cottage directly across from the salt pond. It's referred to as the Sullivan House. It's actually on the National Register of Historic Places. But the Sullivan House, he knew the people that lived there. And two of them were a couple who were actually assistant lightkeepers up at Highland Light. So he had gotten to know them through the magazine article, and that family rented out this little cottage. This cottage is still standing, right directly across from the ramp for the salt pond. So if you ever go by it, you could actually notice it. And he rented this out, and I actually went inside it about 20 years ago, and the lady who was living there remembered Henry Beston. She too has since passed, but she was telling me about how Henry had put up this wallpaper, this blue wallpaper. It was orange wallpaper with blue windmills on it, and some parts of it were still there that Henry had actually put up. But this little place, he rented this for a year, and eventually, and this was one of the notes he wrote to these people, George and Mary Smith, and he used to do these little sketches all the time. He was really into doing these little sketches. So this was 1923, and eventually he decides he wants to build a house out on the dunes, out on the beach, to use as a writing studio. So this writing studio takes shape in the spring and early summer of 1925, and the house is called, he calls it the forecastle, like being aboard a ship, and that's kind of what the house was like in its setting. And he even had stationery made up that said the forecastle, latitude 41, longitude 69. That was the address for it.
If you didn't know where
And this was a picture that one of the Coast Guardsmen actually took of Henry on the front porch in the first year that it was built. And it was a tiny little house. It was only 20 by 16 in size, so not very big, had only 2 rooms. And it was on top of a dune. He actually dragged the workers out there onto the dune and told them this is where I want it. And they looked at him and their thoughts were like, yeah, this guy's nuts. It's gonna wash away. It's not gonna stay there. So this is a really good photograph of the setting. And I always like this photograph. It shows it's only about 20 or 30 feet from the edge of the dune, where the high water might come up, so it was pretty close to the edge. But I also always looked at this and said, geez, can't you just see this in a real estate ad in the newspaper nowadays? It would say something like beautiful scenic seaside shanty, $3.2 million, more than likely. But he also was actually leasing the land at the time, and he was, and the property with it was about 30 acres, if you can believe that, which had long since eroded away. This is the gentleman who built the house. His name was Harvey Moore. Harvey was probably the only carpenter in the town of Eastham at that time. Eastham had a population of roughly 500 in the 1920s. Now it's about 5,000. But Harvey was probably the only carpenter. He was also a town constable, and he hired probably 4 or 5 other men from town to help him build this house. So they put all the bricks, all the wood, everything that was needed on a cart, horse-drawn cart, brought it down the 2 miles south of the Coast Guard station. They get down there, Henry points to the top of the dune, says, "This is where I want it." Harvey looks at him and says, "You'll float away one day," and that proved to be true, but in a different manner. Henry's source of water was a pump. He said, he writes in The Outermost House, how he drove a pipe directly into the dune, and you can, even though you're right on the ocean, you could get fresh water. And that's what they do up at the dune shacks in Provincetown now. They have a lot of little pumps right outside that get fresh water. And if you even go into low-lying areas in the dunes there, you can see where coyotes have dug to get at fresh water. So there is water there. You just have to maybe dig down. But that's how he got his water, was through this pump that was first outside and then eventually was put indoors. And so he starts coming here, and you see him wearing shorts. That was actually laughed at by some of the locals, wearing shorts like that. The woman who lived in the cottage there, whose family rented out the cottage to him, told me that. They used to giggle at him when he wore these shorts, because nobody out here wore those in those days. And he came out here to just do some writing and wander around, and it really began to be sort of a therapeutic thing for him, being out in this setting. And he would just kind of wander the beach sometimes. He would also play his concertina. He had quite the singing voice. He could play by ear, either on the concertina or the piano. So Thoreau had his flute at Walden, while Beston had his concertina at the Outermost House. And so he'd sit there singing sometimes. Other times he'd just walk. He would just wander, nice weather and in bad weather too. He loved going out in the storms. Sometimes he'd accompany the Coast Guardsmen on their patrols. And other times he would just sit there and meditate on the waves. He's got a whole chapter in The Outermost House called The Headlong Wave. And it talks about the rhythms of the surf and how the waves come in threes and all that kind of stuff. And sometimes he would just sit there for hours. And this was, again, very good for a person who was really hurting inside. And his only neighbors was the Nauset Coast Guard Station. And they were up to the north, about 2 miles. This is what it looked like back in those days. The Coast Guard Station that's there now, the old Coast Guard Station, that was built in 1935. So this is what it looked like beforehand. And he would stop there, he'd visit there, get his mail sent there, and the Coast Guardsmen would come down and visit with him at night, or sometimes they would drop off things for him, or he would stop in while they were having dinner, and sometimes on their patrols, they'd come into his house and have a cup of coffee. Henry also had a summer whites uniform from the Coast Guard that they gave him, and he used to wear it around quite proudly. And this is one of the Coast Guard surfmen who used to go and visit him all the time with his son and wife. The son is George Rogner, the fellow I just mentioned earlier, who I was pen pals with. That's George right there, the little kid. And they used to go down and visit with Henry, and he'd come up to their house on Nauset Road in Eastham, and they developed quite a friendship. So again, here's the old Coast Guard station where Mr. Rogner worked, along with a crew of about 9 others. And Henry talked about shipwrecks a lot in The Outermost House, and one of them was the wreck of the Montclair that happened out on the beach in Orleans in March of 1927. And that vessel, he wasn't even there when it happened. 5 men died, 2 survived, and it was a pretty brutal shipwreck, but Henry wasn't even there. He didn't even visit it until a few days later, and he got this Robert Finch and I talked about this a few years back, and Finch said that it was really a remarkable piece of journalism that Beston did in the outermost house, describing the shipwreck. He got all the great details about it without actually being there. He didn't really show up until a couple of days after. So he got a lot of great secondhand accounts and put it into words like nobody else could. This map shows where all the Coast Guard stations were along the outer beach in those days. Starting in 1872 with the establishment of the U.S. Life Saving Service. The Life Saving Service had stations, they eventually had 13 of them. Before the 20th century, they started closing some of them. But they started out up at Wood End in Provincetown, Race Point, Peaked Hill, High Head, the Highland Life Saving Station, which was right near the lighthouse up there, Pamet River, Cahoon's Hollow, Nauset. Orleans had one in the Poche Island area where the Sparrowhawk ran aground back in 1626 in that area, also close to where the Aldea came ashore in 1984. Old Harbor in Chatham, which is now in Provincetown, that's another story in itself. And then you had 3 in Chatham. You had the Chatham Station, also 2 on Monomoy. So he went to all of these, and those little dots, they're all shipwrecks. There were somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 shipwrecks on the outer beach of Cape Cod between 1626 and the middle of the 20th century. So that just gives you an idea, because it was such a treacherous area to navigate. And then there was no Cape Cod Canal until 1914. And even that wasn't very good until the 1930s. Henry used to stay a lot when he was in Eastham at the Overlook Inn, which is now called Inn at the Oaks, located on Route 6, to almost kind of northwest across the street from the Salt Pond Visitor Center. And here he is wearing his Coast Guard duds again, and he's talking with one of the local ladies there. And he used to stay there quite a bit. And he became very friendly with the innkeepers there, the Kellys, Tom Kelly and his wife Mary. And that's what the building looked like in those days. It's now kind of covered by trees, which is why they call it Inn at the Oaks now. But in those days, you used to be able to see out the window. You go upstairs, you could see out the window. You look eastward, you'd see the Atlantic. No obstruction. Same with you turn around, look to the west, no obstruction on Cape Cod Bay. There were no trees at that time, because the trees around here are all fairly recent. The original trees were cut down by the Pilgrims and other settlers in the 1600s, 1700s. And it was barren out here for a long time. Thoreau's day in the 1800s, it was barren. So it was, used to be able to see from up there. And what Mr. Kelly would do, this is how Henry would get his supplies. He would, he'd be out on the beach in the house. Mr. Kelly would go upstairs there at night. Each one of them had binoculars and a lantern, and both of them knew Morse code. So they would communicate this way. He would go flashing one thing, and then Henry would reply, "Come and pick me up tomorrow at 11 o'clock or whatever, so I can go to town and get my stuff." And that's the way it worked. They would do this at night, and it worked really well, and Henry got his supplies that way, and he'd come back and walk down the dunes to his house with everything on his back, in a backpack. Well, this way of communicating, remember this was the 1920s, the era of Prohibition. So a lot of people in town thought Henry might be a rum runner, and this is how he was signaling as to when he would bring in his next load of cargo. Well, that wasn't the case. But Henry did admit to providing shelter for a rum runner or two who happened to be on the run from the law and from the Coast Guard. He said, "I considered Prohibition to be an infamy." So he was very supportive of that. But that's how he kind of got around. And as he was there, he really started to feel something being in this setting. He went from one extreme to the other. He went from the hell of being in the middle of the battlefield of World War I to all of a sudden being in the middle of this nature paradise out in the middle of nowhere. And he loved it. And He wrote this, actually he wrote it in French in his journal, but this was the interpretation. Nature, there is my country, the work to celebrate, to reveal the mystery, the beauty and the rights of nature, of the visible world, to bind this feeling to my name. So that was 1926, about a year or so afterwards. He really didn't come out there at first just to stay there. He was kind of coming and going back and forth to Quincy and to New York or wherever else. And then in 1926, that's when he decided he was going to try this experiment of staying there for a year on the beach. And he pretty much did that. He would kind of come and go even then, but he did he did eventually complete his year. It took him a couple of years to do it. But he also learned that, he said, sentences ought to follow each other like waves of the sea and be as individual as waves. A sentence ought to come in at a spare speed, rise, break, and then withdraw, leaving a free space for its successor. So it kind of helped his writing even. And he also said that living on the Cape has brought out in me a mystic something that shows surprise of life to be quite the biggest thing. And maybe some of you have experienced that, being out in the middle of nowhere on the beach or in the middle of a dune. Well, he always talked about being at one with what he called the life force, being out on the dunes. So it really was therapeutic for him. So I'll give you a look inside and outside too of his house that he had built out there. Again, this is out on the Barrier Beach, what is now Coast Guard Beach. And you can kind of see the house right up in the middle of that clearing there. This was taken from the air in the 1960s probably, maybe the early 70s. And that's the Atlantic and that's Nauset Marsh. So that shows you how remote everything was out there. And here's the house, and you can see in the background where the Coast Guard station is, a little white speck back there. So that's how far out he was. And by this time too, there were several other little cottages, or what they call beach camps, that were out there. This is another angle of what it looked like. And with the shutters closed in the fall, and even, the shutters had to be closed sometimes, even with the bright sun. It got so bright out there. And this is looking towards Orleans and across Nauset Marsh from the house. And again, looking northward to the Coast Guard station. And here you go up to the steps. Now, the house was moved twice. Okay, so by this time it had been moved down closer to the marsh. And here's the setting of it. You go up these steps into the house, up the stairs. Very solidly built house. Onto the porch, you look out onto the marsh. Originally had a hearth fireplace. The second time it was moved, they ended up putting in a wood stove, probably a lot more efficient. And so that was the only way to keep warm. And that chimney too, we actually had a piece of that chimney that somebody had found after the blizzard of '78, and we had it on exhibit up at the Eastham Historical Society for a while, and then we ended up giving it back. But I'll tell you, just a piece of that chimney, that was one of the heaviest things we ever tried to lift. It was brutal. It was unbelievable. But that was part of the house. This was a living room area. There was a living room kitchen area. And this was inside the living room. And you could see the pump coming up where they had a little kitchen basin for it. And this is another look at it. They actually put a gas-powered refrigerator in there. Beston gave the house to the Mass Audubon Society in 1959. So they would rent it out to their members, and that's how Nan Waldron stayed there for so many years. And plenty of books, too. Beston kept a whole bunch of books there, and he left them there for Mass Audubon. And there they put in a couple of extra cots, too. And there was one small little bedroom. And Beston himself wouldn't even use it during the winter because he said it was so cold they would have froze if he tried to sleep in there, so he slept out by the fireplace. In the warmer weather, he would go into retreat to the bedroom. And there was this one little writing area that he had. He would use only kerosene lamps for light maybe the occasional candle. And this blue chair, he actually found it on the beach and brought it back and painted it blue. When the house was washed away, the chair went with it, of course. And then it was found on the beach, and Mass Audubon had it on display for many years. Now the Eastham Historical Society has it. So after all this time being out on the beach, the fall of 1927 comes along, and as he wrote in the book, in The Outermost House, he said, "It was time to close my door, get back to life." Now he had also been seeing the writer Elizabeth Coatsworth for many years. And she was known, she was a children's writer, a poet. She wrote a book called The Cat That Went to Heaven around the same time as The Outermost House came out. And that was a recognized award-winning book. And he came back from the beach after being gone all this time, and he proposes marriage. Now, she was actually a more prolific writer than he ever was, but she knew what a gifted storyteller he was and how he was with words. She called him a great opener of windows. And when he came back to Quincy or Hingham or wherever it was at the time, he proposes marriage, and she wanted to know, well, what about your book? You were out there all this time. Don't you have a book? And he says, well, I got notes. I'll write something, but, let's get married. And she's like, oh, no, wait a minute. Come on, you're really good. You got to write this book, blah, blah, blah. Back and forth. Can you guess who won this argument? She says, if there's no book, there's no marriage. That's how the story goes. That was September of 1927. The manuscript was done by April of 1928. That's how the story goes. Great motivating tool. The Outermost House was published in October later that year. The Bestons were married June of 1929. Spent some time out of their honeymoon out at the forecastle. They didn't go back too much after that. Elizabeth was not as big a fan of it as he was. So they would often stay at the Overlook or some other places in Eastham. But that's the story behind the No Book, No Marriage story. That's one of Henry's nieces actually told that story to Robert Finch, and then the niece repeated it to me several years later. So eventually, Beston and Elizabeth Coatsworth were married. They were living in Hingham for a while, and it was right on Hingham Harbor. Both families were pretty well off, and especially Elizabeth Coatsworth's family, because they had this huge house that was overlooking Hingham Harbor, and I understand it sold for about $10 million, not 10 million, about $3 million about 10 years ago. So that gives you an idea of the price range. But this house here was up in Maine. And Henry was very friendly with a fellow named Jake Day. Actually, his name was Maurice Day, but everybody called him Jake. And he was an illustrator, and he had illustrated some of Henry's early fairy tale books. And he did all these drawings, and Jake Day went on to work for Walt Disney Studios. He drew a character you might have heard of named Bambi.
Oh my God.
And so they were pals, and he told Henry about this farmhouse that was for sale in Nobleboro. Jake Day lived on a houseboat on Damariscotta Lake, and Nobleboro is right off. This is about 40 miles northeast of Brunswick, Maine, and it's just off Route 1. It's not that far, about 3 miles off Route 1. So this house was for sale, and Henry jumps at the chance to buy it. And it was just the beginning of the Depression. I think the farmer wanted out. So Henry got it fairly cheap, and they kind of divided their time there between then and 1944. He wrote a few more books, but nothing that ever approached the level of The Outermost House. That was by far his crowning achievement. And he ended up influencing quite a few other writers. These are just some of them. You got Robert Finch, of course, John Hay, David Gessner, Joan Anderson of Harwich, Sylvia Plath. Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes stayed at The Outermost House in 1957. And Sylvia Plath wrote a poem that's called Hermit at Outermost House. and it's about good old Henry. Bill McKibben, the well-known writer, has said that Henry was one of the most receptive minds America has ever produced. The accounts he gave of a primitive world and its effects on the human imagination are more necessary than ever. Peter Benchley of Jaws fame, another big fan of Beston. He always talks about whenever he's face to face with a shark, he said, immediately the words from the outermost house sprang into my mind. If that seems preposterous, so be it. These words are engraved on my frontal cortex, and they leap to the fore whenever I'm privileged to be in the company of one of these nature's magnificent giants. And he's referring to the passage where Beston writes, we need another and a wiser and perhaps more mystical concept of animals. And that's a very long, we patronize them for their incompleteness, for their tragic fate of having taken form so far below ourselves. And that goes on for a couple of paragraphs. But Benchley especially was very influenced by that, and probably none more than Rachel Carson, Silent Spring and many other books. Rachel Carson said that The Outermost House was the only book to ever influence her writing, and that she kept a copy of it on her nightstand to remind herself of what good writing was. So, and she was also quite friendly with Henry and Elizabeth too. But one Henry was not a big fan of, believe it or not, the other Henry, as he called him, Henry David Thoreau. Henry Thoreau wrote Cape Cod and Walden and many other great American books, but Beston did not consider himself a fan, even though after he wrote The Outermost House, he wrote a letter to his wife and said, I am now the Thoreau Burrow, referring to Thoreau and John Burroughs. But in this case, after a while, Beston really started to hate the comparison because it was coming up quite a bit. And he didn't like having The Outermost House compared to Thoreau's Cape Cod. For one thing, they're very different books. But Beston, if anything, The Outermost House is more like Walden, being in that one solitary setting. But Beston said, I admire Thoreau, but don't care much for him. He wasn't warm enough. And then he referred to him, he said that Cape Cod was quite a dull book. And that he said, but he wrote the introduction to a 1951 edition of Cape Cod. And he said, but I did my best for the other Henry. So The Outermost House got to be very influential, though, particularly in the environmental movement. And right around the 1960s, there was starting to become a movement that was fueled by Tony Peabody, the First Lady of Massachusetts, who was pushing to have a lot of national literary landmarks established. And she wanted to have this one done in particular for Beston, because Beston was not well at this point. His health had been going steadily downhill. He had had a couple of small strokes. He was in a wheelchair. They were really afraid he was not going to be able to attend any ceremony that they did for him. So they quickly threw together a ceremony on Coast Guard Beach on October 11th, 1964. And if they didn't do it by this time, Henry probably wouldn't have been able to go. And there was anywhere between 200 and 2,000 people at this ceremony. It depends on who you ask. But it was a big deal. It brought people from all over the place. The Bestons came down from Maine for this event. And Henry was in pretty rough shape at this point. But it was during this ceremony that they dedicated The Outermost House as a national literary landmark. I'm not sure how official that is, but it was quite the distinction. And Beston got up and spoke, and as did Governor Endicott Peabody, and he was master of ceremonies that day. And he said, your book is one of the reasons that the Cape Cod National Seashore exists today, to protect the beach and the many acres around it for our future generations. So that was a big deal. The Bestons referred to it as the coronation, because he was finally getting the recognition due to him, knowing he'd be remembered and his work would be remembered. And one of the people that was there that day, besides a very young Robert Finch, was Kurt Vonnegut. Vonnegut and Beston were pen pals. They corresponded quite a bit. They had a lot in common. They were both had experienced the horrors of war. And Vonnegut wrote to him, said, "Yesterday I went to hear you speak at the Cape Cod National Seashore, was proud that our lives should have touched at some point, was moved by what your life has been and what you had to say. Your wife is lovely, your park is lovely." Warmly, Kurt Vonnegut. So the house itself, now a lot of people always ask park rangers about it, where is it? And they say, well, it's gone. And they say, well, where did it stand? And they said, well, that's gone too. So you can walk down to the end of the beach and then keep walking some more, because that's where it is. It's out with the sharks. So the house itself, this shows it after a storm in 1933. There was 20 feet of sand in front of it before this storm. And this shows you how close it came. That's another view of it. See right there, not too much room. Henry came down from Hingham because he was afraid that during the storm that something was going to go wrong. And that's what he found when he got there. He started taking stuff out of the house. Fortunately, it survived and they were able to move it pretty quickly back on the dunes. And then in 1944, they had to move it again onto another dune. That didn't last. After 1944, they moved it down close to Nauset Marsh. But then this started happening every time there was a storm, or you had high tides, so it would start getting flooded. And this is probably the last photograph ever taken of the house. And this was the day before the blizzard of '78 started. How many of you remember the blizzard of '78? How many of you were in the Boston area, digging out from the giant snowdrifts? Okay. How many of you were here on the Cape? Okay. Different ball game out here. There wasn't so much snow. It was high tides and wind were the big issue. Here was the forecast for it. Henry Beston had died in 1968, so he was already gone at this point. So February 6, 1978, the forecast is for 8 to 16 inches of snow, winds 25 to 40 miles an hour. No big deal, we get that all the time in the winter here, right? Except this year. But here's what happened. This was a high tide at new moon on February 6, 14.5 feet above mean low water. That's 4 feet above normal. And you combine that with high winds of 92 miles an hour. Actually, down here at the Chatham station, they had recorded a wind gust unofficially at 120. The bathhouse at Coast Guard Beach and the parking lot were completely destroyed, and a 50-foot long concrete septic tank was unearthed near the bathhouse there. This shows you the satellite photo of the blizzard of '78. And it looked like a hurricane. Played TV meteorologist here for a minute. Here's Cape Cod. It's out in the middle. This storm actually had an eye. So that's how intense it was. It was a winter hurricane. And this eye moved over the outer Cape. So while Boston and the South Shore are getting pounded, and Worcester too, the sun came out after all these winds and everything was nice out here. It was in the 40s, people were going out on the beach having picnics, the wind had died down. It was just great because they were watching the spectacle that was going on at Coast Guard Beach and other beaches. And this was Beston's house, and many others were like it too. This was floating by in the marsh. Part of it had been washed away, and this was the view from the Coast Guard station looking south. Just the beach had been completely overrun. This is what they started seeing the next day at Fort Hill. Parts of the house had washed up at Fort Hill. This was Wallace Bailey from the Mass Audubon Society. He was there picking up pieces of the house, and with the dedication plaque, too, that was put on it back in 1964. They ended up having to scrap a lot of this. That's my friend Nan Turner Waldron, who wrote Journey to Outermost House. She came down about a week later because She was living in Sharon at the time, just south of Boston. Well, you couldn't get on the roads after that storm. By the governor's decree even, said don't even bother going out. So she finally was able to get down here. A week later, a friend of hers took her down out onto the beach, and she found the floor of the outermost house, and she recognized everything when she found it, and even part of the pump. Beston's blessed pump, as he called it. There we go. And the forecastle, this is how it looked before the storm in the dune, the top part of this photo. And that's what it looked like underneath. Just 4 posts sticking out of a wet sandbar. That's all that was left. That was, Noel Bile, the late Eastham historian, described it for me. He saw it and he said to me, he thought to himself, wait a minute, how is that? He said, that was in a dune. And then he said, nope, God, that's it. That was the difference right there of what that storm did to that entire beach. This map shows back in the 1920s and the way it is now. So you see that little red dot up there? That's where the house was back in Beston's day. And here, it's out, this is in that stretch of beach where Eastham and Orleans were fighting over access for vehicles. Well, this is where the house was, and now it's out in the, so it's out where the sharks are, basically. Now, this was the letter that Mass Audubon sent out after the storm. They quoted Beston from his midwinter chapter about a similar storm that had happened. And this was the letter that told their members the outermost house is gone. It's gone forever. So the house was gone after that, but the interest in the book and what Beston stood for, it's still there. There's a former park ranger who now works for Mass Audubon up on Beacon Hill. His name's Jack Clark, and he told me that that setting, he said it was truly mystical. He could see why Beston honored it with his book and why it became a national landmark, a national literary landmark. And I love this photograph because it shows the house in that fog, you know, that I spoke of earlier, with the sun just coming through, and there it is, that little icon of outer Cape beach life. And as Nan Waldron wrote, Beston's sensitive understanding of a man's need to recapture his relationship with the total environment is a timeless message, something which every human can seek no matter where he or she roams. The world of the outermost house is really a microcosm in anywhere world, which is different things to different people. And I want to thank you for having me here tonight. And these are some of my upcoming programs. A month from now, on March 28th, I'll be at the Provincetown Library doing Provincetown and the Pilgrims from Cape Cod to Plymouth and back. I'll also have that program at the Museum of Natural History on April 2nd. April 15th, I'll be doing the Portland Gale on Cape Cod at the Sandwich Glass Museum. And rum running on Cape Cod for Tales of Cape Cod in Barnstable. That's July 6th. And I actually have also be doing the Provincetown and the Pilgrims in South Yarmouth at the library there, September 27th. All the details are on my website, dwcapecod.com, and the other things I'm up to. And I'm also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for those of you who are so inclined. So yeah, I got books too. So if you're, I guess we're handling the finances in a different way, but these are the 2 books I have, Henry Beston's Cape Cod. A lot of what I just told you here and more is in that book. And A Brief History of Eastham. There's a whole chapter on Beston and Thoreau and Lyman Richardson and some of the other writers, but also on shipwrecks and rum running and the Pilgrims and agriculture and the National Seashore. A lot of stories about Eastham is in that book as well. So those are available here afterwards. I also have business cards if you want to have any other information. So, does anybody have questions?
What, I mean, did this guy like eat fish every day? Or get sick of
I think
fish?
he did I think he probably did fish somewhat. The question was, did he get sick of it? Was he fishing every day? I think he did some fishing, but he had a lot of stuff brought to him. He was really great at that. A lot of the Coast Guardsmen would fish. So they would bring him, sometimes they would say, hey, you got tonight's dinner yet? And they'd come up with a big fish on a line. Or sometimes he would find beached fish too. That was an easy way. He talked about dogfish beaching quite a bit. Not that he would eat those, but there would be other fish coming ashore too sometimes that were still alive. So yes, that would be also something you could eat. But actually, was he out there with a casting all the time? No, probably not. That wasn't really his thing. But he had his own food supply and everything. You know, he was always going to town getting stuff. And so if he had fish, it was because somebody else gave it to him
And it
usually.
was the money from the books that helped pay for going to town.
Well, he
Booze
was
and
in
everything.
he was from a very wealthy family.
Okay.
So that didn't hurt, his father being a doctor and everything. That was very helpful. So yeah, people always wonder, well, how the heck did he do all that? Well, he had a few bucks in the bank, so. But yeah, he also wrote stuff for magazines and he had some book sales. The Outermost House was the first book that really kind of took off for him. It sold moderately well at first, but like I said, it was never out of print. So it did very well over the long run. And I think the Best in Family still owns the copyright to it. They've renewed it on several occasions. So it's kind of hard to get quotes from it on an extensive basis. Anybody else? Way in the back, you're gonna need the mic.
Well, that's probably not. Were there other were there other people that were able to lease land? I mean, was he like a solo cottage out there? I'm sorry, I came in a little late.
At the time, there were not too many other structures out there. There were a few, what he referred to as fishing and gunning shacks. There would be hunters out there. And Henry was not a big fan of the hunters. But they were probably the only ones. By the time the 1960s and 70s rolled around, there were quite a few other beach camps out there. It was starting to look like Chatham did before all the storms started to damage the ones out here. But there were several other, there were at least a dozen other beach camps on that spit by the time the 60s and 70s had rolled around. In his day, no, there weren't too many. In fact, a lot of other people in town thought he might have been a little cuckoo, you know, wanting to live out there. What the heck is he living out all alone on the beach for, you know? They were probably like that. They thought he was a little odd. Who's this guy coming from the city living out here like that? You know, so some of the people in town thought, yeah, he might be a little nuts. But not too many other people were doing that. Over here?
Based on the slides you have there, he seemed very self-aware while the book was being developed.
He did.
Did he have this whole thing planned out?
Not at first. I think he thought of a book, but he had not written any fiction prior to that, and he was not a big fan of fiction. But he was kind of mapping it out in his head, and I read a 1926 interview with him where he said, he was telling the newspaper reporter, I want to next do a novel about the sea. And he said he was talking about all these things about the sea, but I don't know if you could really call The Outermost House a novel so much, but it was, he had that in mind. And even when he got home, he had no complete manuscript. So and then he kind of pushed it all together. He did write one chapter that was published in the Atlantic Monthly. It was called Night on the Great Beach. And that has some great passages in it, talking about how we're afraid of night and everything like that nowadays. So that's always worth a read. But it took a while for it all to come together, and when it did, it was magic for it. It absolutely worked. Yeah.
Can you tell us, when was the peak of Beston's recognition? And what did he, also a follow-up question, what did he die of and when was that?
Well, he died in 1968. He had been in ill health for many years, and it just totally deteriorated from like 10 years before, after he had a couple of small strokes. So he'd been dealing with pneumonia and gout and all kinds of other horrible things. So he was in a wheelchair most of the time. He was trying to figure out ways to better himself at that point, and it just wasn't happening for him. He was about 70, he was almost 80 when he died. Elizabeth Coatsworth lived to be 93, actually. She died in 1986. But he was, what was the first part of the question?
Well, what was the peak time of his recognition?
Oh, the peak.
Has it waxed or waned since then?
Yeah, it didn't really, I mean, the Outermost House is what won him recognition. And it took a while for it to catch on. But by the 30s and 40s, more editions of it were coming out. So he was starting to be more recognized and more sought after as a speaker and lecturer too. He actually did some brief teaching up at Dartmouth in New Hampshire for a while. But he was always sought after as a speaker in the 30s and 40s more often, and even into the 50s. His legend only kind of grew over the years. It wasn't sudden fame for him so much. It was gradual build-up over the years, and everybody came to realize, wow, what a great book this is, you know. But at first, yes, it did do very well. He got a great review from Vanity Fair magazine when it first came out, and many other people as well. But when that Vanity Fair was a real feather in the cap, because the critic for Vanity Fair, I think his name was John Riddell, something like that, he was known for being a really hard critic, and people were like, oh, he likes this, wow. You know, so he was pretty tough. He was a tough critic, but Beston won him over with The Outermost House. So yeah, it was a gradual build-up though over the years.
Folks, I'm going to jump in and just say that Don has a long road ahead of him tonight. He's heading out to Central Massachusetts this evening. So if anybody has one more question,
Yep.
okay?
We enjoyed the presentation very much.
Thank you.
Does your book allude to or speak to how the legislation occurred for the Cape Cod National Seashore?
Yeah, I go into it somewhat.
Good.
How Jonathan Moore used it quite a bit, and also during the time in the 1950s, they were actually talking about a Cape Cod National Seashore as far back as the 1930s, and it would have extended from Duxbury to Provincetown back then. But getting it was scrapped, and then the war happened, so the Park Service was in tough shape, and then they started sinking money into it in the 50s. And during that time also, they started to think of this area as for a national seashore. So they sent teams of people out here to check the place out and file these reports. They would come out here and do, whether it was history or geology or whatever, biology, they covered everything in these reports. And what did they end up doing with their reports? They ended up quoting The Outermost House on several occasions in these reports. So when these reports were filed, they were filled with quotations from The Outermost House. I guess it was a lot easier to do that than for some less talented park official to put it into words. But he was doing that, those words, and plus Beston was quite an advocate for it. He wrote a lot of letters to people of importance too. Yeah.
One thing I wanted to add, and I think some of our members remember,
Ralph Stevens was someone we knew really well. And in the 60s, Ralph actually did a lot of the mapping for federal government for the National Seashore.
Oh boy, maybe
Yeah.
he did those maps I have.
Everybody remembers,
I have some really
Ralph.
old maps from like the 1960s.
yeah, in the 60s, that was his job.
Yeah, maybe he did them. But they're like real brittle old paper that's rolled up now, but they're huge. So maybe it was him. But yeah, that played a huge role in influencing legislators in Washington, and selling, like I said, Jonathan Moore was doing it quite a bit too, talking to other officials, congressmen, whatever, anybody who was voting on it. So it was, it really did help, make the case, yeah. Anybody else, very quickly, or, okay, we're good, I'm up here, thank you.
Thank you, Don. Grab a book, folks, sign your life away, enjoy it, and then join us out in the grill room for a drink. Thank you.
I had her number, I don't know where it is right now. You got one or no? Thanks, Nick.
Good job, John.
Thank you.